Plato stands alongside his teacher, Socrates, and his student, Aristotle, as one of the three great men of ancient Western thinking. Of the three, he was the most prolific writer, with his many dialogues giving us great insight into the minds of the Greek fathers of philosophy. He founded the Western world's first institution of higher learning and is also considered by many to be one of the most influential authors in history. The details of the early life of Plato are sketchy, with uncertainty even as to his date of birth. The general consensus is that he was born between 429 and 423 B.C.E. in either the Greek city of Athens or Aegina. What is known is that he came from a wealthy family. Some scholars claim that his father, Ariston, was descended from an ancient king of Athens. His mother, Perictione, was also from a prominent aristocratic family. The major source of early biographical information for Plato is the 3rd century chronicler Diogenes. He claims that the child was not given the birth name Plato, but rather Aristocles, in honor of his grandfather. According to Diogenes, it was the boy's wrestling coach who dubbed him Plato, which means broad, with reference to his stocky build. Plato had at least 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister. His father died while he was a child, with his mother soon remarrying. Plato's stepfather, who was named Pyrilampes, was his mother's maternal uncle. This man had been the Greek ambassador to the Persian court for many years and was a close associate of the famous Athenian statesman Pericles. Pericles was the ruler of Athens between 461 and 429 B.C.E. Growing up in a family of privilege, Plato had access to the finest education. He would have had personal tutors in such subjects as philosophy, grammar, mathematics, and gymnastics. He learned to write on tablets and was instructed in the writings of the revered Greek poet Homer. Plato excelled in both intellectual and physical pursuits, becoming especially adept in the wrestling arena. There is even a belief that he competed in the prestigious Isthmian Games, which were held every 2 years in honor of the Greek god Poseidon. He was a hard worker who applied himself with full determination to whatever he set his mind to. In his later adolescence, it is thought that Plato traveled widely. Having visited Egypt, Italy, and the Bible lands, he returned to Athens, intent on pursuing the life of either a playwright or a philosopher. He was soon introduced to the greatest thinker of the time, Socrates. Plato was memorized by the mind of Socrates. For the next 9 years, he studied at the feet of the master. He was challenged to think deeply by the methods by which Socrates forced his listeners to reason for themselves. Rather than lecturing on a subject, he would explore an issue by having his student define the subject under discussion and then pull it apart by way of questions. Through this conversational method of reasoning, the strengths and weaknesses of a certain point of view would be exposed. This method was known as dialectic reasoning. Socrates' methods were revolutionary for the time. Prior to him, philosophy was focused on such metaphysical topics as the nature of being. The vast majority of people considered philosophers to be idealistic dreamers who were completely divorced from reality. Socrates was determined to change all that. Plato established himself as Socrates' favorite and most able pupil. The two would spend hours wandering around as they pulled apart subjects of practical relevance to everyday living, such as what is goodness and what is the role of government in people's lives. Plato was a unique sort of philosopher. As well as being a man of ideas, he was also a man of action. From his early days in the wrestling ring, he had a need to be in the arena, taking part in the action. It was that desire that prompted him to seek an entry into Athenian politics. Plato's enthusiasm for politics was soon dampened, however, following the Peloponnesian War. A pro-Spartan group known as the 30 Tyrants were installed as a dictatorial government in Athens. Though they only lasted for 8 months, Their rule was devastating, with 5% of the population, up to 1,500 residents of the city, being put to death and public rights being trampled over. It was enough to disgust Plato and put him off the idea of entering into the sordid world of politics for good. The ouster of the 30 tyrants brought an end to the chaos, but it also led to tragedy for the philosophical world and for Plato in particular. His beloved master, Socrates, was arrested by the now ruling Democrats and charged with impiety and of corrupting the minds of young people. The arrest of Socrates now put Plato's life in danger. As a well-known associate of the master, he was liable to be arrested himself at any time. Still, he remained and was in attendance at the trial, drawing on his observations in his record of the proceedings, named the Apology. However, he was not present when Socrates was forced to consume hemlock as his means of execution. He does, though, give a dramatic account of his master's death in the Phaedo. Following the death of Socrates, Plato decided that it was prudent to get out of Athens. Thus began a period of 12 years in which he travelled widely. It would be a period during which he would augment the teachings he had received from his master with experience of the world at large. Plato first went to Megara to take refuge, which was just 20 miles distant from Athens. There he stayed for 3 years with another former student of Socrates by the name of Euclid. Euclid was well known for his superior dialectic reasoning ability, and the two men engaged in many protracted discussions on the rights of people and the nature of goodness. From Megara, Plato travelled to North Africa, where he settled in Cyrene. There he studied under the noted mathematician Theodorus. We don't know how long he stayed here, but we do know that he moved from there to Egypt. There are some claims that during this period of travel, he ventured as far as India, where he bathed in the river Ganges, but this is dismissed by most scholars. Having spent more than a decade travelling, writing and studying, Plato turned up in Sicily, Italy. While there, he visited the volcano of Mount Etna, which was the most popular tourist attraction of the day. People believed that looking into the crater gave them an insight into what the underworld looked like. Plato was intrigued with this idea, but he was also drawn to the site through his study of the 5th century B.C.E. philosopher Empedocles. This man was convinced that he was the wisest human alive. In fact, he believed that he was a god. To prove it, he threw himself into the volcano of Mount Etna, only to be incinerated in the molten lava. While in Sicily, Plato also made the acquaintance of the great mathematician Pythagoras. Through his studies of mathematics and music, Pythagoras was convinced that the keys to the workings of the universe could be revealed through numbers. Plato took these ideas on board and adapted them to his own theories. During his time in Sicily, Plato also became friendly with Dion, who became his disciple and was the brother-in-law of the ruler Syracuse, Dionysius II. It is likely that Dion was attempting to procure for his friend an appointment as philosopher in residence in the court of Dionysius. However, this would have been too provincial for Plato, who was an aristocratic Athenian at heart. With regard to his time in Italy, he wrote that he found nothing to please me in the tastes of a society devoted to Italian cuisine, where happiness was held to consist in stuffing oneself twice a day and never sleeping alone at night. He did manage to get into some heated discussions with Dionysius, who was a hothead who always considered himself the smartest person in the room. At one point, Plato found himself compelled to show an error in the ruler's thinking. Dionysius took exception to this, saying that the philosopher sounded like a geriatric fool. Plato shot back that Dionysius sounded like a tyrant. It was a step too far. An enraged Dionysius had Plato put in irons and placed on a Spartan ship that was headed for Aegina. He gave instructions to the captain of the ship to to sell Plato as a slave. Plato ended up being purchased in Aegina by a wealthy friend by the name of Aniceris. He was so pleased to have rescued his old friend that he gave him money to go back to Athens and start up a school in honor of his deceased master, Socrates. In 395 B.C.E., Plato was once again in Athens. He is thought to have spent some time in the Athenian cavalry, receiving a decoration for valor, but he soon became inspired to defend the life of his master, Socrates. After some time in Athens, Plato noticed that there were other former associates of Socrates who were claiming to represent his ideas, inculcating them in young minds. Plato saw these teachers as impure filters of Socrates' truth. This prompted him to found what was to be one of the first organized schools in the Western world. He called it the Academy. Plato's Academy was situated on the outskirts of Athens, in the midst of a picturesque grove of plane trees. The park-like setting was dotted with statues and temples. In the center of the grounds stood a shrine dedicated to the gods of the arts, known as the Muses. Aristotle studied there for 20 years before founding his own school, the Lyceum. The Academy flourished for more than 300 years, until it was destroyed by the Roman general Sulla in 86 BCE. Plato opened his academy, gathering around him a following of young students, including several women. It would have been more like modern-day college, with many communal activities, including Plato having meals with his students. The curriculum of the academy included philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and some natural sciences. Over the door of the academy was inscribed the dictum, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." This emphasized Plato's belief that mathematics was at the heart of truth. Geometric laws formed the underpinning of his core ideas, including his theory of nature based on perfect abstractions. Plato's philosophical views took those of Socrates as their starting point. He held a realist theory of meaning and knowledge. It was his contention that every physical object has a corresponding idea or form. For example, a table is a physical thing that we can touch and see, but there is also such a thing as tableness, which is the form of a table. He believed that we are born with unrealized knowledge of all forms, and our sensory experience helps us to recall them. Plato originally wanted to be a playwright. According to one of his early biographers, Olympiodorus, in his time, the creation of work for the theatre was the pinnacle of Athenian literary genius. It was only when he came under the spell of Socrates that he abandoned his plans to become a tragic or a comic poet. However, in his writings he was able to brilliantly blend philosophy and drama. His 4 dialogues, Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, and Phaedo, are all forms of tragic drama. His description, for example, of Socrates' emotional farewell to his disciples in the Phaedo is enough to bring a tear to the eye. In the hands of Plato, Socrates becomes just as much a tragic hero as did Hamlet in those of William Shakespeare. The vast majority of the writings of Plato were written in the period following the demise of Socrates. His works have been divided into 3 broad classifications: the Socratic dialogues, compiled between 399 and 387 BC, the Middle dialogues, between 387 and 361 BC, the later dialogues, between 361 and 347 BC. It was during his period of travel in the wake of the death of Socrates that Plato wrote the first of his dialogues. The main character of most of these writings is Socrates, who Plato pictures as a brilliant but arrogant genius. Most of the writings are in the form of dialogues or discussions between different characters. In his dialogues, Plato has Socrates and those that he holds discussions with, venturing their opinions on a wide range of topics, including science, religion, art, politics, virtue, crime, human nature, love, and wisdom. He has Socrates contending that knowledge is not the result of the accumulation of study and observation of the world at large. Rather, it comes from our recollection of what we already know. This belief is tied up with the concept of the immortality of the soul and reincarnation. Plato, and by extension Socrates, believed in these ideas. In fact, in several of his dialogues, Plato has Socrates giving speeches on the afterlife. In the years following the demise of Socrates, Plato devoted no less than 3 of his works to the trial and death of his master. These are the Apology, Crito, Euthyphro. A later work, Phaedo, also deals with the subject. In the Apology, the focus is on the trial of the 70-year-old Socrates and his self-defense. The master's contempt and arrogance comes through clearly in this work. Socrates then went on to prove why he was the wisest man on earth, as he had been described by the Oracle of Delphi. Plato explained his theory of pure ideas by using an analogy of a cave. He said that most people are living in a dimly lit cave. It is as if they are sitting in chains, facing a blank wall with a fire at their back. Their view is restricted to a few flickering shadows on the back wall. This, he contended, was how the vast majority of people saw the world. In order to see the full reality of existence, he stated we have to break free from the chains, turn away from the wall, and get out of the cave. The vast majority of people, he believed, were living perpetually within the ignorance of the cave. Those rare few who could break out of it are the objects of scorn and ridicule by those who remain in it. Plato believed that everything we see, from a tree to a horse, is merely appearance. Reality only exists, he said, in the form of ideas. Ideas are universal and unchanging, whereas forms are always in a state of flux. The universal realm of ideas, Plato contended, exists in a hierarchy. The highest idea is that of goodness. Plato introduces the idea of the form of the good in his dialogue Republic. He says that real knowledge is a knowledge of goodness. The more knowledge a person has, the greater the potential for goodness. That is why, he contended, philosophers were the best people to rule. Their higher level of knowledge had provided them with a higher level of goodness. It was Plato's contention that humans were good beings who had fallen from a heavenly existence. They were now trapped on earth to live a dim shadow of their former existence. Furthermore, when humans learned something new, they were actually merely remembering knowledge acquired in the past. According to this view, we are all of a divine nature. There were 3 levels of human nature identified by Plato: passion, courage, and thinking. The goal of life was to deny our baser passions by exercising our courage, which is controlled by our thinking. If we can do this, we will avoid the cycle of rebirth to human life and return to a divine heavenly existence. Plato's star pupil at the academy was a young man by the name of Aristotle. Aristotle arrived at the academy around 367 B.C.E. as a teenager. He remained there up until the time of Plato's death. Aristotle took his master's theories as a starting point to find his own version of truth. He came to reject Plato's idealistic abstractions, as he was determined to base his beliefs on empirical evidence. Rather than coming up with a theory and then fitting his observations of the world to that theory, he first observed the world and then came up with a theory based on those observations. The greatest contrast between Plato and Aristotle's worldviews is seen with the comparison of their 2 great works on political philosophy, Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politic. Republic is presented as a dialogue between Socrates and a number of Athenians and foreigners. The discussion involved what it meant to create the ideal state. Through the voice of Socrates, Plato champions the ideas of communal property and the elimination of a hierarchy. including the traditional family bonds and gender roles. He believed that by breaking free of these societal norms, a society would be able to attain a state of tranquility, equality, and peace. It would also eliminate human selfishness. To Aristotle, however, human selfishness could never be eliminated. It is a part of who we are as human beings. The best that a society could do, he contended, was to put in place procedures in order to place controls on that natural selfishness. To him, the idealistic society that Plato imagined was totally unrealistic and completely unworkable. It would lead to chaos and anarchy. In its place, he conceived a society that had its share of the wealthy and the underprivileged, with neither being dominant. People would have individual ownership of property, and all would work together for the ultimate benefit of the society. A major contrast between the thinking of these two great minds was that Aristotle was able to exercise a greater degree of mental discipline to a subject under discussion, whereas Plato's mind was a jumble of ideas that led him to jump from point to point. His student was able to keep his attention focused on a single issue and continue drilling down on it until he had achieved a satisfying answer. Nor was he swayed by emotion or subjectivity, being solely driven by evidence-based experience. In contrast, Plato was an idealist. To him, ideas were not objective. They could be affected by one's personal opinion. For Plato, a truth could be proven by experiments of the mind, whereas Aristotle needed everything to be verified by direct experience and observation. In 357 B.C.E., Plato made his final trip to Syracuse. He attempted to have a positive influence upon the mind of the young ruler, Dionysius II, but he was unable to make any headway. In fact, he was treated with contempt and held as a prisoner for a short time before being released. Plato died at the age of 80 in 348-347 BCE. There are conflicting accounts as to the place and cause of his death. The most widespread belief is that he died peacefully in his sleep as he was being played the flute by a young girl.